The call came through just as I was finishing the last report on a quiet shift. Shots fired, possible homicide, residential address. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. My partner and I exchanged a glance, already bracing ourselves for what awaited us. The house stood still, a picturesque suburban facade betrayed by the cluster of patrol cars already parked outside. A woman, disheveled and pale, stood at the doorway under the watchful eye of an officer. She was still holding the phone, her face contorted in a mixture of shock and something else regret. Anger. It was too soon to tell. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The living room looked untouched, save for a faint scuffle of overturned furniture near the hallway. Down the corridor, the scene unfolded. A young woman's lifeless body sprawled on the floor, her dark hair tangled in streaks of crimson. A single gunshot wound marked her chest. Blood seeped into the carpet, vivid against the dull beige fibers. "Detective, over here." The responding officer gestured to a handgun lying a few feet from the body. The woman in the hallway, later identified as Tyra Crosby, aged 25, had been shot point blank. Signs of bruising around her wrists suggested a struggle before the fatal shot. My attention turned back to the woman in custody. Stephanie Alexander, 51 years old, was already in the patrol car, her hands trembling but steady enough to write her statement. Her husband, Albert Alexander, stood off to the side, silent and staring at the ground. His demeanor wasn't grief, it was guilt. What happened? I asked one of the officers who had been first on the scene. Stephanie says she walked in on her husband in bed with the victim. Things got heated, and, well, this. He nodded toward the body. Did he confirm that? I asked, watching Albert out of the corner of my eye. Not exactly. Says she came home earlier than expected. He invited the victim here. Says Tyra didn't know he was married. I let that sink in. A domestic dispute, sure, but this had escalated into something far more sinister. Has she admitted to shooting the girl? She called it in herself. Said she panicked, but the voicemail we found on the victim's phone suggests otherwise. That voicemail. It came from Tyra's phone, her last attempt to reach out. It had gone unanswered but not unheard. Her mother had retrieved it and handed it over to us in shock. Listening to it later, the pieces began to take shape: desperate cries, indistinct yelling, and the unmistakable sound of blows. It was chaos captured in a few agonizing seconds, a glimpse of the terror Tyra had endured before the shot rang out. Back inside, Albert was finally talking. I didn't mean for this to happen, he muttered, his voice low. I met her at a club. We were just talking and I invited her over. She didn't know about Stephanie. She didn't know. And yet she ended up dead in your hallway, I said flatly. You invited her here. You knew your wife's schedule, didn't you? Thought you had the timing down. His silence was deafening. Stephanie's version was fragmented, her voice breaking as she repeated the same line. I didn't mean to kill her. I saw her there in my bed. I lost it. I leaned in. This doesn't look like a crime of passion, Stephanie. You had time to stop. You had time to think. What happened after you saw her? Her gaze darted around the room, avoiding mine. She was just there, and I couldn't think. I grabbed her. I wanted her to leave, but she cut herself off, her hands shaking. I didn't mean to shoot. It just happened. Except we have evidence that she tried to call for help. That voicemail. And the bruises on her body suggest you didn't just grab her, Stephanie. You beat her. The room fell silent. Outside, the coroner's van pulled up, and the sight of Tyra's body being placed in a black bag seemed to finally break her. She sobbed, her hands covering her face as her husband stood frozen, offering no comfort. As the scene was processed, more unsettling details emerged. The bedroom was in disarray, with broken glass and splinters of wood near the bed frame. Blood spatters suggested a struggle had started there before moving to the hallway. Tyra's purse was still slung over the back of a chair, her phone on the floor, its screen cracked. It wasn't hard to piece together what had happened in those final moments. Tyra had walked into a situation she didn't fully understand, invited by a man who had lied to her. Stephanie had come home early, blindsided by her husband's betrayal. What started as anger spiraled into violence, leaving a young woman dead on the floor of a house she had no reason to be in. As the officers loaded Stephanie into the squad car, her sobs continued, interspersed with muttered apologies. Albert remained silent, watching as his wife was driven away. But for Tyra's family, There would be no apologies, no explanations that could bring her back. Her mother's face, etched with anguish, flashed through my mind as I left the scene. This wasn't just about a love triangle gone wrong. It was about a young life cut short, a betrayal that led to tragedy, and a household forever fractured by violence. And it was only the beginning. By the time Stephanie Alexander was booked and officially charged with voluntary manslaughter, the case had taken on a life of its own. Tyra Crosby was no intruder. She had been invited into the Alexander home by none other than Albert, the husband. The deeper we dug, the more it became clear this wasn't a simple crime of passion. It was a web of lies and selfish decisions, spun by the very man who now claimed to be an innocent bystander. In the interrogation room, Stephanie sat slumped in her chair. Her earlier sobs had subsided, replaced by a hollow stare. She avoided eye contact as I laid out the details. We have evidence of a voicemail Tyra left during the assault. She called her mother while you were attacking her. It's not just a single gunshot wound, Stephanie. She was beaten before she was killed. Her eyes flicked up briefly, her lips trembling. I didn't mean to hurt her. I swear. I couldn't control myself. Couldn't control yourself. I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. You didn't just shoot her. You tortured her. There were signs of restraint, bruising around her wrists and neck. This wasn't a split-second decision. It was deliberate. She flinched at the word but didn't argue. Instead, she glanced at the two-way mirror, as if someone on the other side could offer her salvation. No one came. Outside the interrogation room, Albert Alexander sat in the waiting area, fidgeting with his wedding ring. His eyes darted nervously toward every passing officer. His account of the events remained shaky at best, filled with half-truths and deflections. You met Tyra at a club that night. I began as I sat across from him in a second room. Had a few drinks, danced. Invited her back here. That sound about right? He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I didn't think it would lead to this. What exactly did you think would happen, Albert? Did you tell her you were married? Did you let her know that bringing her here could get her killed? I didn't. He cut himself off, rubbing his temples. I didn't think Stephanie would come home early. She usually works late. And yet she did, I said, leaning back in my chair. What did you think would happen if she found you in bed with another woman? Did you honestly believe there'd be no consequences? His silence was telling. As the evidence poured in, the story began to take shape. Security footage from the club showed Albert and Tyra leaving together around 2:30 a.m., their movements casual, unhurried. Tyra had no idea she was walking into a powder keg. By 3 a.m., they were inside the Alexander residence. A neighbor recalled hearing faint music and laughter, then silence. It wasn't until hours later, when Stephanie returned, that the night took a deadly turn. The voicemail Tyra left for her mother was a gut-wrenching piece of evidence. Her voice, panicked and strained, came through in fragmented phrases. She's hitting me. I didn't know. Please, Mom. The sounds of blows landing, muffled screams, and Stephanie's voice shouting something indecipherable filled the recording. It ended abruptly, leaving a chilling void. Forensics painted an even bleaker picture. Blood spatters in the bedroom and hallway indicated a violent struggle. Tyra's injury suggested she had tried to fight back, though she was ultimately overpowered. The gunshot wound to her chest was clean, almost surgical, suggesting that Stephanie had regained her composure long enough to deliver the fatal shot. This wasn't just rage, it was calculated. Tyra's mother, Tanya Hoskins, arrived at the precinct the next day, clutching her daughter's voicemail recording like a lifeline. Her grief was palpable, her eyes rimmed red as she demanded answers. Why isn't that woman being charged with murder? She asked, her voice trembling. My daughter didn't break into that house. She didn't force her way in. She was invited. And now she's dead because of it. I explained the process, how charges were initially filed based on the evidence available, but her plea struck a nerve. She planned this, Tanya continued, her voice rising. You don't beat someone like that unless you mean to hurt them. This wasn't self-defense. It wasn't an accident. The voicemail was the key. Listening to it again, it was impossible to deny the premeditated nature of Stephanie's actions. The assault wasn't a momentary lapse of control, it was prolonged and vicious. Albert, meanwhile, walked free. Legally, there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. He had invited Tyra into the house, yes, but his role in the events that followed was murky. His lies, however, painted him as a man whose deceit had set everything in motion. He's as guilty as she is," Tanya said bitterly when we shared the news. "If he'd kept his vows, my daughter would still be alive." It was a sentiment shared by many, though the law saw it differently. Stephanie pulled the trigger. Stephanie orchestrated the beating. But it was Albert's betrayal that had lit the fuse. As I reviewed the case file later that evening, one thing became clear: this wasn't just a case of infidelity spiraling out of control. It was a tragedy born of selfishness, cruelty, and a complete disregard for human life. Tyra's death wasn't just the result of a single bullet, it was the culmination of every bad decision Albert and Stephanie had made that night. The question lingered in my mind as I stared at Stephanie's mugshot: was this murder born of passion, or something darker? And how far had Albert's lies gone to cover his own tracks? There was still so much to uncover. The events of that morning set off a cascade of consequences, as the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department worked to piece together the circumstances that led to Tyra Crosby's untimely death. The community awoke to the shocking news of a woman killed in what should have been the sanctity of a private home. The whispers in the neighborhood began to evolve into an outcry, fueled by the tragedy's sordid details and the stark reality of its consequences. Albert Alexander, a man who had seemingly walked free, found himself under an unrelenting spotlight. Neighbors began to recount the couple's marital strife. Stephanie's sudden outburst, they said, was not entirely out of character for a woman pushed to her emotional limits. Albert's actions, however, remained the focus of the public's ire. He had brought Tyra into their home under the guise of secrecy, setting into motion a tragedy that would irreversibly affect everyone involved. For Tyra's mother, Tanya Hoskins, the grief was insurmountable. Her vibrant, outgoing daughter was now gone, her life reduced to a chilling voicemail recording. The discovery of that voicemail haunted Tanya. In it, she could hear her daughter's muffled cries and the terrifying escalation of violence. Tanya handed the evidence to the police, determined to see the charges against Stephanie upgraded. She attended every hearing, her face etched with pain but also resolve. Family and friends of Tyra held vigils, their candles lighting up the night sky, a poignant tribute to a life extinguished far too soon. Tyra's younger siblings struggled to comprehend what had happened, their family left in a void of unanswered questions. Tanya refused to let Tyra's memory fade, calling on the community to stand against the violence that claimed her daughter's life. Albert and Stephanie's marriage was left in ruins, their once private turmoil now public spectacle. Stephanie, out on bond, returned to her home only to find herself isolated and vilified by neighbors who saw her as a murderer. Albert, on the other hand, tried to feign normalcy, but whispers of his infidelity followed him everywhere. Their children were caught in the middle, struggling to reconcile the father they admired with the man who had caused such chaos. They watched their mother face charges of second-degree murder, while their father seemingly escaped legal accountability. The family's fractured state became a reflection of the deeper societal issues at play: betrayal, unchecked rage, and the consequences of deception. The case sparked fierce debate online and in community meetings. People questioned the system that allowed Stephanie to walk free on bond mere hours after Tyra's death. Many argued that Albert bore a significant share of the blame, with his deceit serving as the spark for the tragedy. The dialogue grew heated, with some sympathizing with Stephanie's rage, while others decried her actions as cold-blooded and indefensible. The incident brought to light broader conversations about domestic disputes and how unchecked emotions could lead to catastrophic outcomes. Social media became a battleground of opinions, each comment further dividing a grieving community. The discourse illuminated the fragility of relationships and the devastating ripple effects when trust is broken. Behind closed doors, investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the evidence. Detectives revisited the voicemail recording, analyzing the timeline of events and Stephanie's version of what happened. Prosecutors faced mounting pressure from Tyra's family and the public to ensure justice was served. Meanwhile, defense attorneys for Stephanie argued that the situation was a crime of passion, not premeditated murder. Albert, though not criminally charged, was interrogated repeatedly. The police sought to uncover the extent of his involvement and whether his actions constituted criminal negligence. His claims of ignorance about his wife's potential reaction were met with skepticism by investigators, who probed deeper into his history. As the investigation progressed, the Charlotte community grappled with the ramifications of the crime. Churches held forums on forgiveness and the limits of anger. Local organizations began advocating for mental health resources for families struggling with infidelity and betrayal. Tyra's death became a rallying cry for accountability, not just for the Alexanders, but for a society struggling to address the pressures that led to such a tragedy. The stage was set for a trial that promised to expose the complexities of human emotion, betrayal, and the irreversible consequences of a single moment of rage. The city held its breath, waiting for the justice system to deliver its verdict, one that would reverberate through the lives of all involved. The house was eerily quiet as I stepped through the door, the weight of the investigation pressing down on me. Tyra Crosby's body had been removed, but the energy of violence lingered in the air. Each detail I observed told its own story: a broken lamp in the corner, drops of blood trailing from the bedroom to the hallway, the subtle signs of a struggle. What had transpired here wasn't just a crime, it was a deeply personal eruption of rage. Stephanie Alexander was already at headquarters, her initial statements recorded. Her demeanor had shifted from the frantic cries of her 911 call to a measured coldness, as though the weight of her actions was only just beginning to settle on her. She had been cooperative, answering every question with a directness that made her account hard to pick apart. But something about her tone left me uneasy. Her story felt too rehearsed, too polished for someone who had just taken a life. Albert Alexander, on the other hand, was a different puzzle altogether. His responses during questioning had been guarded, evasive. The more I probed, the clearer it became that he had orchestrated a dangerous game that ended in tragedy. His account of the night seemed designed to shift blame away from himself, emphasizing that he had never expected things to escalate. He repeated that Tyra was a guest and claimed he had no idea how his wife might react if she returned unexpectedly. But his evasions told a different story. The voicemail left on Tanya Hoskins' phone was the piece of evidence that stayed with me the most. Listening to it for the first time, I had to steel myself against the sounds of Tyra's final moments. The recording revealed the chaos, the terror, the raw violence. It wasn't just the sounds of a confrontation, it was a visceral descent into something much darker. Stephanie's voice, a mix of fury and anguish, told us everything we needed to know about her state of mind during the attack. The evidence collected from the scene painted a grim picture. Tyra's bloodstains, signs of blunt force trauma, and the gun used in the shooting left no room for doubt about what had occurred. But as we pieced together the evidence, the question of intent loomed large. Was this a premeditated act of vengeance, or had Stephanie truly been overcome by a moment of unbridled rage? What struck me most was the psychological warfare that seemed to permeate this case. Albert's deceit, Stephanie's betrayal, and Tyra's unfortunate presence in the middle of it all created a volatile mixture. Stephanie's actions were undeniably violent, but Albert's role couldn't be ignored. He had brought Tyra into his home, knowing full well the precariousness of the situation. His cavalier attitude during questioning only deepened my frustration. Stephanie's insistence that Tyra was an intruder crumbled under scrutiny. Witness accounts, combined with the details from Albert and Tyra's interactions that night, confirmed she had been invited into the home. Still, Stephanie clung to her narrative, shifting her reasoning to self-defense as the motive behind her actions. She claimed she hadn't meant to kill Tyra, only to protect herself and her home. But the brutality of the scene told another story. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this case was as much about the emotional fault lines within the Alexander household as it was about the crime itself. Stephanie's frustration, Albert's lies, and Tyra's unwitting involvement collided in a moment of irreversible violence. Our role as investigators wasn't just to determine what happened, it was to unravel the complex motives that drove each decision leading up to that tragic night. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of the case never left me. Each piece of evidence, every interview, every analysis of the voicemail brought me closer to understanding the chain of events. But no matter how much clarity we achieved, one truth remained: the cost of human betrayal had never felt so devastating. The trial was set to be one of the most emotionally charged cases the court had seen in years. As the lead investigator, my responsibility didn't end with the arrest or the evidence collection. It extended into the courtroom, where the story of Tyra Crosby's final moments would be retold, dissected, and judged. Stephanie Alexander sat at the defendant's table, her expression unreadable. Her defense leaned heavily on the argument of provocation and self-defense, claiming she had acted in the heat of the moment. Her attorneys painted a picture of a betrayed wife who had come home to a shocking discovery, her reaction fueled by emotions she couldn't control. It was a story meant to humanize her actions, to explain the unexplainable. But our evidence painted a far less sympathetic portrait. The voicemail Tyra left her mother, the blood-stained bedroom, the bruises on Tyra's body, all of it suggested that Stephanie's actions had gone far beyond the bounds of any reasonable reaction. The voicemail, in particular, became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Its contents were graphic, capturing the escalation from verbal confrontation to physical violence. It was impossible to listen to it and not feel the weight of what Tyra had endured in her final moments. Albert Alexander, the man at the center of this tragedy, was called to testify. Watching him take the stand, I felt a surge of frustration. Here was a man who had lit the match that led to this explosion, yet he sat there as though he bore no responsibility. He admitted to inviting Tyra to the house but denied any intent to deceive or provoke his wife. His testimony was filled with contradictions, a tangled web of half-truths designed to absolve him of guilt. Still, his presence on the stand forced the jury to confront the role his actions played in this tragedy. Tyra's mother, Tanya Hoskins, attended every day of the trial. Her presence was a stark reminder of the human cost of this crime. She sat silently, clutching a photo of her daughter, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. When it was her turn to address the court, her words were devastating in their simplicity. She spoke not just of her loss, but of the injustice of Tyra's death. She made it clear that she sought accountability not just for Stephanie, but for a system that allowed her daughter to be vilified in death. The jury's deliberation was brief, a testament to the strength of the evidence. Stephanie Alexander was found guilty of second-degree murder, a charge that carried significant weight. As the verdict was read, Stephanie showed little emotion, but her husband, sitting in the gallery, hung his head in apparent shame. For Tyra's family, it was a small measure of justice, though it could never undo the loss. The impact of this case rippled far beyond the courtroom. In the weeks and months that followed, it became a focal point of community discussion, raising questions about domestic violence, infidelity, and the consequences of unchecked emotions. Stephanie's actions were condemned, but so too was Albert's role in creating the circumstances that led to Tyra's death. He may not have faced legal charges, but in the court of public opinion, he bore the brunt of the blame. For me, the case was a grim reminder of the complexity of human relationships and the devastating consequences of betrayal. As an investigator, I had seen my share of tragedies, but this one lingered. It was a stark example of how quickly lives could unravel when trust was broken, and how the decisions of a single night could reverberate through countless lives. In the end, the case was closed, the evidence catalogued, and the files archived. But the voices of those involved, Tyra's cries for help, Stephanie's panicked 911 call, Tanya's pleas for justice remained with me. They served as a haunting reminder of the cost of human frailty and the importance of pursuing justice, no matter how difficult the path.